really a plenary. It's sort of, it's going to be a new type of format of plenaries. So you're going to hear from 4 different people today, all of whom will give a quick lightning talk, and then you'll hear them in conversation with each other. You will have time at the end for some Q&A. Our theme for this plenary is around shifting power, and again, coming back to this idea of moving from the why to the how. We'll hear from 4 speakers who will talk a little bit about ways that they have attempted to shift power to communities, to those at the heart of their work in their own work, and we'll share the trials and tribulations of those. So again, I will introduce our first speaker, Mari Qureshi, president of the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund, for her first lightning talk.
All right. Thank you all. Please keep eating. The food's awesome. But I do warn you that the hummus does have a lot of garlic in it. I did not fully realize that when I took it. So for anyone thinking about that, it is very garlicky. I can't really see this slide, and I'm not sure you can either. Yeah, vaguely. Okay, well, I will use this. This is better. Okay, this is better. I head up the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund. And for those of you wondering, who is Jessie Ball DuPont? Here's your answer. In the back here is a young woman, part of a large family. Over there to your far right is her father, a Ball. The Ball family of Virginia. For anyone from Virginia who might know the Ball family, one of those blue blood families. If you've heard of Mary Ball Washington of George Washington fame, that's the same Ball family. So a very blue blood Virginian, as you might imagine, a daughter of the American Revolution. And a daughter of the American Revolution based in Virginia is also a daughter of the Confederacy. She was the 3rd wife of Alfred I. DuPont, the gunpowder chemicals DuPont of Wilmington, Delaware. And while there is a Jessie Ball DuPont Fund, there is also an Alfred I. DuPont Testamentary Trust. The bulk of Alfred's fortune went to that trust. We ended up with the fortune that she had, which was a lot smaller. Jessie got married to him when she was 39. She was a vice principal of a public school out in California when she got married to Alfred, and by that stage had become, her own little engine of philanthropy. She had begun squirreling money away. The Ball family, by the time she came on the scene, was not well-to-do. They were a very well-regarded family, but as you can see, the house behind this family is not very elaborate. She used to go around the county when she was a teenager trying to collect on her dad's invoices, which she was not always successful at. So she didn't have a whole lot of money, but she was an educator, and she very much believed in the power of scholarship to be an elevator in economics and social mobility. She had begun making scholarships to students, even as a vice principal of a school. And so as you might imagine, we have a complicated legacy. On the one hand, a very generous woman. On the one hand, a woman who, in that era, an unusually sort of professional, capable woman. But on the other hand, very much a daughter of the Confederacy, was quite active in sort of the myth of the lost cause, and also in enforcing segregation. On top of that, we have a fund that is the product of her will. We do not have a charter. When we get asked for a charter, we're like, no, we don't have a charter. We got Jesse's will, which is many, many pages long because she had a very detailed will and throughout her lifetime changed her mind about who should get what, who should execute what, and the whole bit. But what we ended up with is a grant-making entity that has very specific restrictions on their grants. We can give to those organizations that receive funding from Jesse between 1960 and 1965, about 300 or more named grantees, and then other organizations supporting the temporary relief of people in need in the states of Virginia, Delaware, and Florida. So unlike many funders, we can choose grantees only when they meet condition number 2. Everything else has to come out of condition number 1. So the power relationship between us and our grantees is a little different than a funder that is at liberty to do what they think makes sense. So it's been an interesting exercise getting around this, not around this issue, but just sort of leaning into this issue. And when I showed up at the foundation, there was a sense that we should hang back and wait until one of the named grantees came to us and said they wanted money, which was, in some sense, those 300 plus grantees, they didn't have guaranteed access to funding, but they were competing in a very limited pool. And our declination rates are quite low, as you might imagine, because there is a limited pool of grantees. And we were, at different stages, funding things that made sense. So we didn't have an eye to, this is what we want to accomplish in the world. We just sort of said, well, come to us. If it's sensible, we'll fund it. And this was borne out in the grantee perception report that I ran in 2019. Like, people really liked the fund. The grantees did. So when I showed up, there was this question of how do we leverage that strength? And because I thought we should have clarity around the change we want to see in the world. And the too long didn't read version is we focus on placemaking and equity in the communities that Jessie loved. So honoring her intent around place and the importance of community in shaping people, but repudiating her stance around issues like segregation and leaning into repairing some of the harms that may have been caused by previous grant making. And so we ended up having to really think about how do we really leverage our relationship with our grantees to invite them to go on the journey we wanted to take around placemaking and equity. So an example would be Stratford Hall, the birthplace of Robert E. Lee. It got resuscitated because it was central to the lost cause, but they are themselves going through this journey of, well, we can't be Robert E. Lee's birthplace. We have got to be more than that. So they are trying in their own way to reflect the full history of what life at Stratford Hall was like, which numerically, there were a lot more enslaved than there were enslavers. So it's a much more rounded story. We support them in that journey because it is part of our learning and it is part of their learning around equity. So, this is just a very, not all funders are the same. Funders have peculiarities just like nonprofits. And I want to leave you with that before we get into the conversation with Thais. Your turn.
Okay, hello everyone. I will jump right into it. I won't make any introduction about myself, but my name is Thais. I work with Civicus. We are a global alliance for citizen participation. And today, we are going to have a very uncomfortable conversation. I'll be building on what was spoken earlier with Gabriela, that she was inviting us to be more uncomfortable. So that's what I'm going to do today. Um, so yeah, so I will speak about relationships, about collaborations, about failures, about unlearnings, and also what we learned together with 5 grassroots activists from, I'm not sure if you can see their faces, but from South Sudan, the Philippines, Zambia, Mexico, and Madagascar, during a year-long co-creation journey to co-create the Grassroots Solidarity Revolution campaign. So this campaign was to advocate for an improved resourcing landscape for grassroots activists. And I'm sure all of you realize that I said a year-long co-creation journey, so it took us a lot of time, and that's why it can be perceived as something that is uncomfortable, especially in this environment that we are. So yeah, together, so this campaign, in this campaign, we wanted to mobilize the ecosystem to become better grassroots allies, to bring to the fore grassroots views, voices, and asks, and to test if a participatory influencing communication and strategy campaign would make our campaigns at Civicus more relevant and impactful. So that was the campaign, what it was all about. Can you see the slides? I have the feeling that yeah? Okay, but it's fine. So yeah, together we learned that most of the time in a donor-grantee grassroots relationship, we don't have space to make mistakes. The relationships that we are building, they're very superficial, they're linear, they're transactional, extractive, and they are based on this idea that grassroots activists, that they can't fail, that grassroots are superheroes, that being a grassroots isn't a job. And the relationships, they are actually not as transformative as we would like to perceive within the sector and in funding relationships in general. They remain very transactional, as I said, linear, based on this capitalist idea of productivity. And as part of the campaign, we created spaces for multi-stakeholder engagement with grassroots activists. And we learned that spaces like these, they should be smaller, informal, more intimate spaces for reflection, which allows feedback and improvement in the co-creation journey, but also in the engagement with grassroots activists. And it must be a space where we allow good and bad forms of feedback too. And know that it's in spaces like this, in environments like this, that they feel safe enough to be vulnerable, to criticize, to complain, and to grow too. Spaces like this, they are still very rare. Today and yesterday we heard many amazing initiatives, but they are still very rare in our sector. And most of the time, the only exchange that a grassroots activists have with donors are during the grant-making window, and only if donors have Q&A sessions, for example. There isn't opportunity for a grassroots to truly know who is behind these organizations. And what we also experienced and we heard was a general discontentment with spaces that aren't two-way, where don't and enablers too, they would join just to listen and not to be in conversation with these organizations and with these grassroots. Of course, this is because they're mindful of power dynamics, could be, but what we don't realize is that this also generates and perpetuates another layer of power dynamics too, where grassroots, they can show their vulnerabilities because they need the money, and donors and enablers, they don't show their vulnerabilities because they're the ones in charge of the money and, of course, the power too. Um, so yeah, and then we continue to have this very superficial relationship forever because we're not challenging the way we work and the way we think, because we need to unlearn everything that we know about these relationships, about grant making, and we need to be vulnerable. So I'm here today to invite all of you to be vulnerable, embrace failure. It's a beautiful thing. Be uncomfortable too. We need to unlearn how to be together. We need to be conscious about the change that we want, the change that we need, and that it can be hurtful. It will most probably be hurtful, but it's worth it too. It implies decolonizing our way of thinking, our way of doing, and in Western cultures, and as I'm sure all of you know, this is not well encouraged or well accepted or encouraged. So this is something that we need to move beyond and know that this transformation is all about going through this experience together. It's all about the communities we are building. It requires a lot of intention to show yourself as someone that is vulnerable. And yeah, so just to finalize, in the grassroots solidarity revolution, we are creating spaces like this, both online and in person. So if you're interested in joining one or in organizing one yourself, let's chat. I'll be around. And yeah, to finalize, I wanted to encourage all of you to rethink, to experiment, and to invest in spaces like this because they are worth it. And just to finalize, I wanted to thank all of you for listening, but hoping that soon we'll be in conversation too. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mari and Thais. Now we'll hear them in conversation, chatting with each other about what they all just talked about.
So I wrote down my question. I will just read it. What have you observed as the biggest difference in how grantees react to your requests for feedbacks at the fund, where they have more security about their funding than in situations where they have less security? How do you and your staff approach this conversation differently?
So I actually have at least 2 of the program officers at the fund here somewhere in the audience behind the Klieg lights. So you might want to follow up with them on the more granular aspects. But I was struck with not just the candor with which grantees tell us about what has been achieved and or what they have heard from their constituents that they serve. Verging to, having, when we announced a shift in our strategy, there were people who were like, where'd you come up with that? Why are you doing this? Which isn't, having been on the other side of the grantee-funder relationship for some time, as a grantee, it would not have occurred to me to ask, well, why are you shifting this way? So I do see a difference, and I think I attribute that to the fact that we have a very different context in which we operate, which is that these 300 organizations know very well that they were specified in Jesse's will, and that in a certain sense are entitled to funding from the foundation. Now, I will say that when we introduce the idea of getting feedback from the people they serve, and we work with feedback labs to hold webinars and crash courses with our grantees, those of them that opt in. It's also, something that many of them haven't thought about. And part of that is because some of our grantees include 12-person parishes. There are tiny little organizations that do not have a huge amount of capacity to do anything, let alone think about systematically getting feedback from the people they serve. So I think it's sort of pushed us to think, what is the capacity building we need to engage in to allow our grantees to more frequently, systematically listen to the people that they seek to serve? Which actually kind of leads me to the question I have for you, Thais. So small organizations and grassroots organizations tend to be closer to the issues and tend to be closer to the people they serve. But it doesn't make them 100% correct all the time, because notwithstanding that, we each kind of come up with our own biases of, these people need this. And we get hung up on it. We get obsessive about the this that we think they need, and we're not that open to sort of hearing, well, maybe you might not be right. And also, grassroots organizations are by definition lower ratio of staff expenditures and cash expenditures. They frequently don't have a lot of technology systems behind them. What do you hear from the groups that you work with about what we as funders could be doing to support them to get more feedback while not turning them into a large-scale INGO with all the baggage that comes with that?
Thank you. So my short answer is to support movements and organizations with flexible and multi-year funding. So that's my short answer. But I think that if we enable movements and to grow collectively, this is also going to lessen the responsibility and the burden of individual activists and individual organizations, because they're going to grow as a community, as a movement, as a collective. I also think that humanizing activist work isn't about toxic visibility, because activists, they are doing an amazing work. Yes, they are resilient. Yes, but we can't frame them as superheroes, because when we do this, I think we create this culture of idolizing individuals instead of their movements and their communities. And what we do with this is just it's not decentralizing the conversation, but I think we need to celebrate activist work by better resourcing their movements and their organizations, and not by framing them as someone that is not human, and therefore they can work 24/7, work 24/7 without needing money to pay their bills, to support their families, and to pay for healthcare. So yeah, and this also leads me to my next question that I have for you. So it's when you were speaking earlier about the way your fund works, and I think it's also always very complicated to find that balance between call for proposals and the burden, the stress, and the expectation it can generate in organizations, especially grassroots organizations, activists, and movements. But on the other hand, how can we ensure that we are democratic and inclusive in systems like yours, in approaches that are invitation only, for example?
Yeah, and this is a question I really struggle with, right? We have a defined list. We can, under certain circumstances, dip into funding other organizations, but there's a definition, fairly narrow definition, of temporary relief. Well, What's temporary? Obviously handing out disaster relief supplies is temporary. Is, you know, is a temporary intervention in a juvenile offender's life a temporary relief? Relief from what? It gets very complicated very quickly, and I end up having to go to our lawyer to say, does this pass muster? So, in reality, we are at our best when we work with organizations that are already inside our portfolio, with whom we have great relationships, and some of them are in the room here. So that creates a little more dependence. We depend on our grantees, perhaps more than funders who can sort of say, well, I didn't like the way that this grantee did their work. I'm going to switch. And so it creates a dependency between us and the grantee. And it dampens that competitive tension that is generated when we have an open call for proposals, $10 million, $100 million to be given out for some amazing initiative, and hundreds of people respond, which by definition means your chances of getting that $100 million is lower, right? And I think of all the work that goes into each of those individual proposals, and 99% of them are not going to get rewarded for all the work that they just put in. There's one person or one organization that ends up getting that money. So I think it's some of the same dilemmas that you raise around being in the context of a capitalist competitive world, which has its own upsides. It sort of makes it possible for new organizations to emerge who promise to do something better, faster, more effectively, and yet, there are bodies by the wayside through this competitive process. So I really don't know how to kind of get rid of that tension. In some ways, I'm insulated from it because there is a will, and it says you will run your business a certain way. And yet there are times I wish that I could go out and do an open call, because I'm sure there are organizations out there doing amazing things, and I feel frustrated that I can't do that. So one thing, we had conversations leading up to this session, and one thing that I found really interesting, Thais, in what you said is, stop asking us to talk and have you guys listen, because we as funders are trying to listen to our grantees. And you said, grantees are tired of having you listen to us. Let's have a conversation. So what advice would you have for a funder like us to make that happen in a way that's authentic, generative, and leads to better outcomes for both the funder and the grantee?
So in this co-creation that led to the Grassroots Solidarity Revolution, we were during one entire year building trust and building a relationship with these activists and with their communities, because it was not only the 5 activists that was in my presentation, it was also their communities and another. We also had jam sessions, we call it that way to show how informal they are. So we also had these jam sessions where it was self-organized by activists from, I think, 11 countries, 11 different countries, apart from the ones from the presentation. And the time we took to really understand their lives, their experience, it played a very important role in how they engaged and collaborated with the campaign. So I think we were building a friendship, not only a relationship. Um, so I would say to keep this in mind that it's all about actually making a new friend and working together to support the communities we all serve. So that's what's the first thing I would say to keep this in mind. And another advice would be to build spaces that are where they feel comfortable enough to be and safe enough to be vulnerable, to leave and return without failures or repercussions or things like that, and be so completely available to this experience to the point that you're looking for unintended outcomes or failures as learning opportunities, not as something bad, something good. And I think also to don't be, I know as that this as a sector we do this very often, but I would say don't be prescriptive on the outcomes because the most important outcome is the journey anyway, is the relationships that we are building. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's, was it Art yesterday who said, and maybe you don't need a logic model? I think it was Art. Um, it's hard, right? So I showed up at the fund and I didn't feel like we had a thing we wanted to achieve. So I was like, surely we have to have a change we want to see in the world so that we can measure ourselves as to whether we're making that change. But, you sort of challenge that by saying, well, isn't it really about the journey? And I can definitely speak to the journey. I mean, we have, I mentioned Stratford Hall. We're working with the University of the South on racial healing circles. Perhaps it is about, the relationship we can continue to strengthen between ourselves and our grantees to achieve the outcomes that we seek. And those outcomes may change, as you just said. And so we can't get too wedded to whatever outcome we set out in our big strategic plan and our vision. But I want to, by the way, give a shout out to Thais, who is doing all of this in her non-native language. So, kudos to being able to code switch so effectively. I'm just so impressed. Thank you.
That's nice, thank you.
A big round of applause for Mari and Thais, our first pair. We have one more pair, so I'll introduce, have Ronnie and Michelle come up, our next pair of lightning talks and conversation. And first up is the amazing Ronnie King.
Good afternoon. All right. So we just realized while we were sitting there, it's actually 7 minutes. So we're going to try to make this work. All right. So I wanted to kind of start off by just giving almost a little bit of a background. So I am actually not in the nonprofit sector. I am literally a community volunteer. My background is in technology. But again, like a lot of folks in this community, and in our communities, they're doing volunteer work all the time. And so I wanted to kind of just share a little bit about how I got started, and hopefully that'll explain a little bit about the work that we're doing in Jacksonville, Florida. So I know it's a little hard to see, but when I moved to Jacksonville, Florida back in 2006, I was doing a lot of like volunteer kind of community work and almost living literally like these two different kind of nonprofit lives, right? So on one end, you had all these grassroots organizations, the 100 Black Men of Jacksonville, the Urban League, the National Society of Black Engineers, so on and so forth. But on the other hand, I was actually on several boards, several commissions, with organizations that had like these multi-year commitments, right? And all of them are doing like equity work, but obviously you have these grassroots organizations that simply just didn't have the funds to really make their work scale. So yeah, you should be able to see that. But really we had this question as a community, why haven't Black communities experienced sustainable improvements, right? We had a lot of organizations that turned in great annual reports. Almost no nonprofit in our community would ever say like they're not doing a good job, right? All the annual reports say, oh, we're doing amazing work. And all this stuff. But you look across the community from a indicator perspective, Black community still have reading issues, still have health issues, still have poverty issues. And so as a volunteer community, we really started thinking, how can we go about changing that? I put this little slide up here because that math was just not mathing for us. So really the equation in itself was like, if we are trying to ultimately solve issues in the Black community, right? I mean, I know we have a lot of $25 survey gift cards going out, and we had like the little participatory micro grants and things like that, and it's like, that was cute. But ultimately, at the end of the day, right, in our community, we were trying to impact the Black community, but the Black community was not the ones that was leading the work. We were the ones that they kept asking for feedback from, right? We kept giving feedback, we're giving feedback, and and I sat on a lot of those boards. They looked at me in an instant like, how do we get more feedback from the community? And we got these gift cards, and let's go out there and obviously the gift cards annoys me a little bit, but but really at the end of the day, it just did not add up, right? If we want to see changes in the Black community, we need to make sure that we are letting the Black community lead from the front, not just from a feedback perspective, but from a solutions perspective. So we decided we were going to put together a coalition of Black-led nonprofits. Most of them have the same pains, right, when it comes to funding and feedback overload, but all of them are doing great work. Fraternities and sororities in our community, like I said, the 100 Black men, so on and so forth, and decided, how can we collectively take some of this power back, right, combine our resources, and really start doing work for our community, right? We want to be able to put that feedback immediately in action, and so that's really what we came together to do. And so you probably can't read it at the bottom here, but really our goal was to, from a collective, we want to build the most scalable community engagement platform for the Black community. So that's really our goal at the end of the day. So a few stats here about our collective. So we have 95 grassroots organizations. Pretty much almost all of them are literally in Jacksonville, Florida. So that was a big kind of aha moment for a lot of the funders in our community. They was like, oh, it's probably just a few of y'all. Like, no, it's a lot. A lot of people are doing a lot of great work in the Black community, but when we go to conferences and things like that, we don't see ourselves in that work, right? So we have 95 organizations. For those that can't see, before we did the last survey, we had combined annual budgets of $2.9 million. So I just want everybody just to sit on that for a second, right? In Jacksonville, Florida, we had 95 Black-led organizations, a lot of equity work, $2.9 million combined budget. We polled the organization, so we're serving collectively about 12,000 families. And again, we are a community fund of volunteers, philanthropists. And so what we like to do is we literally pass the hat. We go out and try to get funds for the collective. And so as a part of that work, we've been able to give out over 200 grants. And again, these are sub-grants, kind of the best we can do. But 200 grants. Oh, did I do something wrong? Oh, okay. Oh, there we go. All right. So we gave over 200 grants to organizations over the last couple years. But a big part of our work isn't just from a funding perspective. A big part of our work is actually getting these organizations to work together, right? And so we create community projects really so that organizations can, A, learn about each other's work, but B, how do we scale the work if we're not working together? And so the community projects in itself is a big part of what we do, and it's hard work. It's hard to get there's a lot of egos, a lot of pride, and all that good stuff with these organizations, but getting them to work together is something that we really pride ourselves in. So if you can see here, but this is an attendance initiative that we decided. We got feedback from the collective, right? It says, we would like to just recognize students that are coming to school every single week on time for attendance. We think we can do something with that, right? So we collectively got together. It really is 7 minutes, right? So we collectively got together and did some attendance work. Here are some of the other projects that we did as well. We have some storytelling, so organizations want to get a chance to get their stories out, so we come together to do that work. We have a workforce development collective, and so National Society of Black Engineers, and several other organizations of that 95 get together to do some workforce development work. And obviously, we come together as a community twice a year to recognize volunteers and organizations and students that have done great work in our community. So that being said, we don't have it all figured out, right? We're experimenting, we're trying this thing out, we're trying to see if it works. But we truly believe when it comes to like shifting power, at the end of the day, you know, we want to make sure that these organizations, again, if we're talking about Black communities and we're talking about equity work and those types of things, right, we need to make sure that these organizations are leading from the front. And so a big part of our goal really is to, you know, if we can't change the system, how do we go around the system, bypass it, and see if we can make sure our collective resources are making an impact, you know, in our community. Thank you.
Thanks, Ronnie. Hi, everyone. So these folks asked me to talk about the tension between federal policy change and community organizing in 7 minutes. So here we are. My name is Michelle Hughes. I serve as Operations and Impact Director for an organization called the National Young Farmers Coalition. I will start with a shameless plug. My breakfast table is tomorrow at 8 a.m. if you want to hear more about my organization and myself. I don't have enough time to go through that right now, but I'll tell you a little bit more about me before we get started. I used to be a hog farmer. This is a picture of me with pigs. Jeez. I also work in operations at Young Farmers and Human Resources. I also lead some work at Young Farmers that we call racial equity and accountability work. I'm sure some of you are familiar with that. We are at a feedback conference. And I also oversee lots of the feedback loops and to help institutionalize them across the organization. So a little bit more about Young Farmers. We are a grassroots organization. I've heard a lot of people talk about organizers and community facilitators the past couple of days, which I love to hear. We are an organization of community organizers, including our farmers. So a lot of the work that we do is in service of shifting power to young farmers in the US. And so a lot of that work includes bringing farmers to DC for fly-ins, sometimes by the hundreds. It also includes fellowships where we train farmers on political education and help them get leadership positions all the way in their counties, all the way up to USDA and the federal government. We also have membership. We have general membership for farmers, along with chapters and organizational partners as well. So I'm going to skip through a little bit, tell you a little bit about our power positionality as an organization. So Young Farmers calls ourselves a bridge building organization. And what I mean by that is we, as I mentioned, we try to create relationships between farmers and primarily members of Congress and folks in the executive branch. And we use data to communicate the narrative for young farmers. So tomorrow I'll talk a little bit more about the Young Farmers Survey. We did a survey of about 10,000 young farmers in 2022, and I'll talk through the results of those, but it is really the main method by which we communicate with the government and policymakers about changes we expect to see for young farmers. For the most part, federal policy is a slow process. We talk about incremental change, and the tension that exists primarily for us is that we have a very radical membership base, very radical community organizing base, and we are up against a movement in federal policy that is quite slow and incremental. And so that's really where the tension lies, and we've seen over the past few years sort of a shift in the conversation around power because of the political climate, the pandemic, things of the like. I don't need to explain all of that to you all. But the reality is what this is doing for the movement, at least and I don't think this is unique to the agriculture industry, but what this is doing for the movement is it's making it really hard for us to address some of the feedback. You don't need to read all of this right now. It's making it difficult to address some of the feedback that we're getting because, frankly, the feedback that we get from young radical, young farmer organizers really pushes the limits of already pretty progressive spaces. And the feedback that we're getting is really about things that are sometimes truly out of our control. So we do our best to mitigate what's happening, but we're really up against some big structures that we're trying to shift the power to be able to control, but we really, truly don't have control over them. And will take generations and generations to get that kind of control. And so what's happening is sort of what Thais was mentioning earlier is we're struggling to maintain capacity in the organizing field. And folks are burning out, people need rest, and are saddled, unfortunately, with a reality as a community facilitator or organizer that's like pretty rough. And so I want to bring your attention, for those of you that maybe haven't seen this article, it is a joint effort between Maurice Mitchell is the author, joint effort between, he's a organizer, lifelong organizer. It's a joint effort between Nonprofit Quarterly, Convergence, and The Forge, I believe. And it's an article that I think really speaks to what we're experiencing somewhat at Young Farmers and in the movement for agriculture more generally about building resiliency in organizations of community facilitators. And so it talks, this is a very long article. I would read it only when you have time because it's worth reading the whole thing. But it talks a lot about the sort of the reasons why this is happening, the problems that we face in our movement, the underlying causes of those problems, some of which I've touched on briefly, and some of the symptoms that we face as organizations as a result of some of these issues. Maurice also talks about some pretty concrete solutions, and I will end my almost 7 minutes with that. There is sort of at the end of this article a list of solutions, and I think it's a long list, but the most salient for me and that I want to communicate to you all is just that we need to support community organizers significantly more than we are at this moment. And I don't just mean in the way that we see now, which in this article is called unanchored care. We right now see a push for very like short-term solutions for community organizing, and we need to be thinking much larger. This article touches on longer-term strategy for community organizing, developing a shared understanding, co-creation through feedback, which might sound familiar, with community organizers, and so really leaning into that. But I will also say as an operations professional, something that really resonated with me from this article was just a lack of compensation and employee benefits programming that exists for community organizers. Across the nonprofit sector, community organizers are paid the lowest out of everyone at the organization, and they're told that that is an industry norm, which is very, very problematic as the folks that are on the front lines of this work. So I encourage you to read this article, and I think I will stop there. I will just say, the last thing I wanted to mention is, in addition to all of the strategy that I mentioned and employee resourcing and things like that, we also just generally need to focus more on relationship development. And this is something that every single person I think has sort of touched on. But even with structures, we still have to be more human-centered in our thinking about how we support these folks, because their work is really, it's based on relationships. So I will stop there. I think that's the end of my 7 minutes.
Thank you. Let's hear it for Michelle. I'll invite Ronnie to come back up here. And then we'll have a conversation between the two of them while we're moving the chairs. I will just say that both Ronnie and Michelle are two of our 2023 Feedback champions. So as you can imagine, we have a great group. And now we'll have a little bit more than 7 minutes to hear about, you know, the tensions and problems in society.
So we told ourselves while we were sitting there, we have no questions for each other. So we're just going to have a conversation, I guess.
Yep.
I'll let you start.
Really? After I almost fell? Okay. Well, I guess when I'm thinking about our presentations together, I'm wondering if you see a way, I know you didn't get to this deeply today, but I'm wondering if you see a way. We talk a lot about resourcing this movement. Ronnie and I candidly have talked about resourcing from within. And so I'm wondering if you have ideas about, this is a question, I'm wondering if you have ideas about what we can do for community organizers internally. A lot of the work that I talk about, I think, is more about external, but curious if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I didn't get a chance to get to it in the presentation, but one of the things when we keep talking about feedback from a community perspective, it seems like there's so much need for it. It seems to be valuable for organizations that aren't grassroots, right, and funders and things like that. And so, in some ways, one of the things we're trying to do from a technology perspective is actually, capture our own feedback and find a way to monetize that for our own community, right? And so, and that's been a difficult thing to do. You kind of have to kind of create a firewall, but basically say, no, if you want this information from the community, we're going to package it, we're going to put this in a tool, and then we're going to sell it back to you, and that money can go right back to the community. Again, that's just one way, but I truly believe, we talk about the problem of funding and lack of funding, but I think in Jacksonville with the My Village project at least, I think the solution for us hasn't necessarily been, okay, let's convince funders to do it differently. The solution for us has been like, okay, we have to find a way to, I don't care if it's $1 million a year, we're going to generate funds together and then, distribute that back out to the community. So that's kind of one way we're thinking about it. Yeah. How about you?
I think it's touch and go for us a little bit, and I can really only speak to my organization, which by the way is an organization of about 50 or so folks at this point, just for scale. And I think we rely pretty heavily on external funding, and we have for some time. I think we have very unique and strong relationships with our funders, which is nice. I don't think that is the case. As I'm hearing here, though, it's nice to hear that that is becoming a more normal thing. I think we have really strong relationships with our funders, and so we really are in partnership with many of them, but we're also looking, funders have limitations, and we have a lot of limitations in terms of general operating support, which is what I think most of you probably know, like funds salaries and the organization just kind of running and things like that. And I think that's been kind of a challenge for us because as we think about, I mentioned unanchored care earlier, when we think about long-term anchored care for community organizers, it's a long-term thing, and resourcing that internally is a very difficult challenge for us, but working on it.
I will say too, and this is one of the things we try to preach to the organizations in our community, so much of that power, we talk about shifting power, so much of that power rests in the funding, right, and the money. And, one advantage that, that we try to tell our organizations is that the bad part is that we're kind of organizationally poor as a community. The good thing is that we're organizationally poor as a community, right? So we don't, we never had it. And so anything that we get, as a collective is going, to a good place. And so I think that, if we can find a way to, again, funding, everybody needs funding, right? But I think, in the Black community, I think if we can find a way to kind of disconnect ourselves from that need or the feel like, hey, we got to get this funder to fund us, or we need this foundation to help us out. If we can somehow disconnect ourselves from that and, again, try to leverage the resources from within, I think for us, that's shifting power. And what it's done for us, even when we do go outside the community for funding, we have all the leverage, to kind of say, well, we can walk away from that funding if it doesn't align with exactly what we want to do as a collective community. Because again, it's only going to help, but we can do this anyway.
Yeah, I think it will take, as I said, I see a small shift, but I think it will take a bigger shift in philanthropy for that to not be the case for many folks. But I think something else that we're not necessarily naming that I would like to name explicitly is that a lot of, at least in our network, like a lot of young farmers of color are very much rooted in the idea of anti-capitalism, and so are not super invested in furthering relationships with the philanthropy sector as a whole. So I think that that's also a challenge, is trying to build that trust between us and them, and to share the trust that we feel like we have with our funders as an organization with our farmers. So I think that removal has been kind of difficult for us as well.
What do you see as kind of, I guess, ultimate success, in your dream world? What would be success for you? I know it's a tough question on the spot.
Yeah.
I'm not a good interviewer. That's not my job. I'm sorry.
No, I think I mean, I will give you the shortest answer I can possibly think of. In terms of, in this specifically, I mean, I think I have big dreams for young farmers to be like in leadership positions across the US, on water boards in the West, and as a part of like all of these federal commissions that we see coming out of USDA right now. I have dreams for farmers to be a part of that. But I think like really, I am an operations person. I'm our operations director at Young Farmers. And so my biggest dreams are that like my staff can come to work as their whole selves as they wish to do. And their personal values never be like up against, and it will never be seamless, I understand, but I wish that there was a way for their personal values to be more aligned with that of the organization, more aligned with that of our funders, and I think we're getting there. It's going to take a long time, but I think that would be my ultimate dream, if we were more values aligned just like across those power dynamics. If anyone has suggestions on how to make that happen faster, let me know.
You know, I'll add too. I think you know, really for us, you know, to have an ecosystem where, you know, communities can kind of generate the resources that they need to kind of do what they want to do. That's kind of our big dream. But you know, it's from a philosophy perspective. You know, I kind of liken a little bit to, if we were talking about like gender equity. I know it's not kind of popular maybe to say this, but if we were still having, and we are, but you know, we're having issues in that area, and when you looked around, there was just all these male-run nonprofits that were in that space, and you know, we brought obviously, you know, women and others into the conversation, right? But I mean, or we got their feedback, right? But ultimately, like at the end of the day, the people that controlled the money, the people that, you know, sat in those positions did not look, you know, they weren't women. Everybody would point to them and be like, well, that's probably the problem, right? That's probably the problem. And so I think, you know, it's no other community, in my opinion, other than sometimes the Black community for some reason, or a lot of BIPOC communities, where somehow we think that we can still get enough feedback to overcome that problem. We can't get enough feedback for that, right? There's not enough feedback that you can get unless you put the community itself in the position to lead. We're going to have the same problem, you know. So I think we have to, at some point, make a decision. Do we want to fix that problem as a, you know, a nonprofit community, or, you know, what are we trying to do here?
Yeah, I agree with you. And I'm going to say something that might be even also controversial, but I think the reality is that people want to shift power until you have to give up your own personal power yourself, right? Everybody is like, in theory, very in favor of this, but then once it's like, I have to actually give up my seat or my power or my money specifically, all of a sudden we don't understand, and it's a very complex process, and everybody has to fill out a lot of applications. But I don't know that that has to be that way.
I think we're at our time.
Well,
We've
don't
been
worry.
rambling.
We have time for Q&A. We'll put the lights back up. I'll invite Mari and Thais back up. I am confident that this group will have a lot of questions for our four panelists here. So start thinking about your questions. It can be to one of them specifically, thanks, or to the group. So we have some mic runners who, as they're getting their seats, who wants to go first with the very first question? I think Art over here, yeah. And then if you want to just say your name, organization, and then ask your question as well. And they are setting up.
I actually want to ask a question about the last statement that was made during the presentation about giving up power. And conceptually, I really get it. I mean, what we really want is for people to be willing to say, I'm not powerful, so you can be powerful. But there's also something meaningful in being empowered to lead. And as a leader, you've been assigned power by those who allegedly are supporting you. And I wonder if we can accomplish the same goals by changing how leaders operate, rather than saying to them, the solution is for you to give up power. Because again, I think we get power because people want us to have it in many cases. Now, that's not that's not the same as structural structures that put people in positions that they don't belong in. But when there are institutions that have been organized well and have assigned leadership positions to people, the power they possess is for a reason. And I think we have to be mindful of how we use it, but I don't know if giving it up is the answer. So I just was curious how you might respond to that or talk me off the ledge, so to speak.
We're all up here mentally fighting who's going to go first on that one. I'll say, my perception sometimes of power is really is kind of a feeling, right? When I think about, you think about, let's say, police brutality, right? In theory, me driving down that street at 11 p.m. is no different than a white man driving down that street at 11 p.m., right? The difference is that how, if something was to happen, I get pulled over, do I feel like I have the power, if I'm not doing anything wrong, to just walk away from that situation safely, right? And another person might feel differently. And so I think, leaders or not, I think that at some point, communities need to feel like if they wanted to do something, I heard an example earlier, I know it was kind of said in jest, but, the community wants to drill oil, in their own community, right? And it was like, obviously that doesn't align with that foundation's missions, right? But at the end of the day, if that community wanted to drill oil in that community, why, if they had the power, they'll just drill it. I think that's a feeling. And so I think that it's not about I think we need leaders in organizations that mean well and are doing those things, but at some point, we have to really know that, okay, well, power means that community, that group of people feel like they can do whatever they want to do. And they can see and make whatever change they want to make. I think that's real power.
Can I? Yeah, it just gave me I was thinking actually about this because the session that we had here in this room before was about participatory grant making. And at Civicus, I carry two hats. So I'm also a funder. I coordinate the Solidarity Fund, and I work with the grassroots too. So I think and the fund, the Solidarity Fund, we are a participatory grant maker. So the decision-making body of the Solidarity Fund, they are community members. So Civicus, as I'm sure you know, is a membership-based organization. So this body is composed of Civicus members from all over the world. There are 10, and they are the ones in charge of making all the decisions related to the Solidarity Fund. So the power is not with me, it's not with Civicus, it's with the community. So it's with Civicus members. So yeah, I think there's also a different way of doing this. We are also seeing many co-leadership positions. There are many organizations starting to do this. So I think it's also another way of sharing the power and sharing the power with the community too. Yeah.
Anyone else have any nice, easy questions like that to ask? We have some mic runners. Just raise your hand. I see someone in the back. I can't see who it is because of the lights, but Ali maybe, yeah.
So a very moving and powerful presentation from all of you. My question's first for Michelle, but maybe for the rest of you as well. One part of the power, I was thinking of you talking about the farmers you work with and yourself, is the power of knowledge that each individual farmer has. And, when we think of whether it's a farmer here in the US or in Burkina Faso or in Cambodia, there's a knowledge that each of those farmers possess that maybe we don't leverage or aggregate or amplify. And so, just from your own experience and sort of your very creative thinking, which obviously came across in the panel, how might we better leverage that power, that knowledge, to then bring that to the decision makers of these large institutions, like my own, like others, to see that in engaging them, we're not doing them a favor. We're actually integrating a corpus of knowledge that we're just not tapping into at scale. So it's a big question. You don't need to solve it, but would love sort of some of your ideas, because you seem to be getting at that.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, firstly, I agree with you. I think I have a few things to say. I think one is the production of food and production agriculture is not valued as much as it should be. So I think that contributes a little bit to why the individual farmer doesn't seem like someone who is very powerful, because their social status is quite low, at least in the US, my experience. But I think the other thing is there is, for sure, and I see it as someone who takes food and agriculture very seriously and production agriculture very seriously, I think that there is a lot of power in the individual farmer, which is why we do a lot of this organizing. And I think, how can I say this? There is some coalition building around shifting the knowledge of young farmers in the next generation, particularly because of climate crisis right now. And so this might be a touch point where I think the young farmer population, and I can only really speak for the U.S. in my organization's reach, but I think that like young farmers, particularly young farmers of color, are like leading some of the solutions that we see for climate crisis. And without access, I'm getting into the weeds a little bit, young farmers also, the number one challenge that they face is land and a lack of land access. And so those two things together, I think we need a solution for climate crisis. I don't think anyone in this room, hopefully, would disagree with that. In my world, it's like something I have to talk about every day, multiple times a day, all the time now. And so I think that young farmers kind of hold the keys to some of the solutions there. And like, there's a lot of, and young or not, like indigenous practices just have a lot of knowledge. There's a lot of knowledge and power there. I think that's just erased along with this population of people. So I think there's like a ton of power there that is just truly untapped. I think climate might be the avenue. I can't really see you back there, but I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, I can't really see you either, so I'm not exactly sure who it is. I did hear the question very clearly. And I think you raise a really interesting point about information and the power that is inherent in information. Sometimes people have information and don't know that it has power, right? They're so close to the work, they know the work intimately, they don't know that this nugget of information that resides only in their brain and their hands is valuable somewhere else, right? So there's the lack of awareness of the power that knowledge gives you. And then there is the valuing of that knowledge by others, including society at large. So to your point, Michelle, about if all the farmers went on strike, we would all be in trouble. But we don't really think about that, right? And we don't ever accord them the respect and the gratitude that we should have to the people who make sure that there's food on our tables. So there's a social dimension of information not being valued at the quote-unquote price that it should be valued at. And so I do think there is something that we might do collectively about sort of getting a little bit more intentional about recognizing knowledge, if it isn't power that we recognize, and maybe perhaps recognizing knowledge and expertise and lived experience, and trying to figure out what price, what value that has to society at large, and perhaps that's a way of getting at some of the things you've been talking about. Because what you're in effect saying is that, you know, Ronnie's idea of putting the community in charge is because underlying it all, you have this assumption that they know things that funders who are however many removes away don't know.
All right, any more questions? Yeah, in the back, I think we have Christian. And if you could just say your name and your organization as well. There's a mic coming to you now. There you go.
Thank you. Oh, okay, there we go. Hi, my name is Christian Medina. I work for Open North, which we're in Canada, Montreal. Hi, everyone. So I guess this question is more for Ronnie. You mentioned how you were monetizing on the feedback that the community is giving. I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more to that, if it's sat well with your funders and people that make demands of data from you. It seems like it's really challenging some of the assumptions that in the funder-fundee relationship. So just very curious to know how that went.
Well, thank you for the question. And we do have some funders, in Jacksonville and outside of Jacksonville that definitely support our work. But by and large, we don't have really a collective relationship with funders, right? And so I think in a lot of communities, you'll see the same thing when we talk about grassroots organizations. And so, again, the benefit of that is that we can kind of do whatever we want to do. The thing with the data capturing, and we're not quite there yet. We're kind of still in the process. But one of the collective ideas that we had, and again, these, when I say collective, we're talking about the leaders of all these 95 organizations, was that we wanted to not only build a tool for that data capturing, from our community, but we wanted it to be built literally by the community. And so we have 25 college students, Black college students in Jacksonville, Florida, that are majoring in computer science. And so we've collectively literally passed the hat and are paying those students to build out this application for us. And so our hope is, once we get a little closer to that reality, that's something that, again, it's useful for us in-house. I think that's not even something that we have, we've of course have dreams of maybe somebody outside of our community using that, but it's really so that we can track our own collaboration and connectivity and say, okay, this organization is doing workforce development, this one's doing mental health, this one is doing academics, this is the student. How can we combine our resources together to make it happen? And again, it's an untapped market of volunteers, Black people in the Black community that are helping and doing excellent work. So we think we can solve it in-house.
Anyone else? We have Jordan. I'll just hand you my microphone.
Thank you. So I think there's a question in here, but I really have been stewing over here in this thought that we have to ask people to give up power. And I'm queer, trans, non-binary, and I think my identity has allowed me to perhaps see something that I didn't see before I was aware of my identity. And it's really that, are we asking people to give up power, or are we asking them to return power to people who already had it? Like, the modern context is that the world is better now than it's ever been, but that's totally not true. Like, indigenous communities were great, and then we stole power from them. And if we're are we asking them to give it up? Or are we saying, like, power is something that has been stolen? Power is something that's a construct. Like, shared humanity is really what it's all about. So, I don't know, like, do we own anything? Is power real? Like, can't we just say, like, hey, everybody, work together? I don't know, like, when someone says, like, I'm in charge here, I have the power, I want to say, like, check yourself. Like, let's all be in this together. I don't know, respond or not.
Jordan with the easy questions. Power, huh? Question mark? Go. Who wants to take that first?
I think that was a statement, wasn't a question. I don't think there's anything we can say here. Anything we can say.
Ditto.
Well, I'll turn it back to the story, Jordan, that you told in the session that I was in early this morning, which is that his organization, instead of taking money from a funder who in the typical way of things would be in the driver's seat, right, handing out money to his nonprofits, his nonprofit instead turned around and told that donor, so what are you really doing for LGBTQ rights? Let's like do a whole diagnostic of what you're doing before I take your money. I was like, well, I've never seen the tables turn that way before. Because they wanted something from him. He was like, well, no, before I take your money, because that's what they wanted him to do, right? Take his money, take their money. It's like, well, let's look at what you're doing here. So, I mean, I see your point. With that kind of experience, I think you do have a perspective that allows you to say power, question mark. Who really holds it? But I don't know. That kind of pushes us into, who was it who was talking about brave space? And how we need to, right, Thais? You were saying it took it a lot of guts to sort of tell the funder, yeah, maybe I might take your money, but let's go through this first.
I'm actually glad you said that. I mean, one of the, it's a hard conversation to have, but I served as president of the 100 Black Men of Jacksonville for a while, and we almost got to the point we'll have people that would come and say, hey, we're going to give you a $1,000 grant, right? And of course, we're thank you, and the next thing that happened was we're taking these photos and, we got these big checks, right? And in our mind, over time, it was like, I think we're almost doing more for them taking this money than we are with the money. And so we've gotten to a point where it's like, yes, why are we taking this money? Let's have a deeper conversation. And how do we get to a point where we're asking, we need some feedback from the funders to say, why we're not gonna, that does more for you than it does for us at this stage. And so, I think that's somewhat taking that power back when it comes to that funding space.
Thanks. We have time for one more question. So who wants to follow up with power question mark? I think we have one in the back here.
It's not.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Yomara. I'm from Puerto Rico, and I work in the Center for Habitat Reconstruction. And I just thinking about everyone saying, at the end of the day, what we're really talking is about money. Power is money. So, and that's maybe a question we have to ask. And we mentioned about indigenous people had power, but that power was transformed, like we took their land. And a lot of other marginalized communities, we've taken and monetized on that. And that money is uneven, right, in the structure. So we're really talking about money and how do we redistribute that money. People usually have power because they have a lot of money, and people can do whatever they want because they have a lot of money. So if we like changing and be willing to give power is when we're willing to give money, like reducing salaries and making it more equitable along, as a society.
All right. Any final comments from our 4 participants? Maybe we'll start with Michelle.
I don't have a super strong thing to leave with you all about shifting power. It's very difficult work. I do want to say I appreciate those of you that are bringing to light this question of what is power and how can people hold power and how can we shift power, how can we share power. And I think one thing that as a person who is operations but also a policy person, I would encourage you to think about that as well. Like we have talking a lot about money, and I know that legislation is also related to money, but there are a lot of power structures that exist within local, state, and federal governments, and that power is very real, and it is written down on paper, and everyone has to abide by it as long as the people who are in charge with the title say so. And so I just want to bring policy into the conversation a little bit and leave you all with just the idea that we all have power in this political system, and that's whether you decide to be a part of it or not. So, thank you.
Thais.
I also don't have any closing remarks, but I just remember actually yesterday we had a session on accountability in the classroom, and one of the things that the panelist was speaking about was how donors, they feel more comfortable to share when they are in a space only with donors. So I had this in my head, and I was like, why is that? I mean, it's because there's trust. They build a space with trust. So maybe that's something that we carry my head as founder in the Solidarity Fund too. We all need to do to build spaces with activists, with movements, with communities where we can have trust, where we can build this trust and talk about uncomfortable things too, because that's how we build the trust. So yeah.
like everybody else, I don't have any amazing closing remarks, but I want to say, I'm definitely encouraged, when I think about, feedback labs and conferences like this. I've met a lot of people that I feel like their heart is in the right place, right? And, I would just encourage those folks that wherever you're at, whatever nonprofit or foundation, really try to, just keep pushing yourself, when it comes to thinking about how to shift power. Are you doing something that has always been done, right? And are you just tweaking it a little bit, or are you literally trying to flip it on top of its head and see if we can do something completely different? I mentioned before, a lot of the stuff that we feel like we're doing is like we're experimenting, right? We have no clue if it'll work or not. And I would just encourage those in this room that have a passion for shifting power to literally get in that experiment, phase and try some crazy stuff out as it relates to shifting power.
So I have two things. One is to echo, Michelle, your closing thought about at the end of your presentation where you said, we all talk about shifting power until it comes time to giving up our own power, and then it starts getting, but that's a very complex thing to do. So that thought really resonates, and I think, need to sort of sit with that a little bit. The other thing I would say is that having come to these Feedback Lab summits for now several years, it has grown significantly. I can't remember how many people were in the first Feedback Labs, 70. And so this is at least double? Yeah, more than double the number of people. And I remember the distinct feeling in the room with the 70 of like, we felt like we were in some sort of vanguard, cell, real kind of subterranean movement that was trying to infiltrate. This does not feel like that anymore. This is a field this is now a thing that's out in the open, and we're talking about it, and we're strategizing and doing tactical stuff, but it is a thing. So I just want you to reflect that y'all have grabbed the power from somewhere, I don't know where, and it is a much more powerful field today than it was when it started out. So just sit on that.
Big round of applause to our 4 speakers who all said they didn't have nuggets to leave us with and left us with mind-blowing nuggets. So thank you. And now is the moment everyone's been waiting for, the moment Annie comes back.
I think people are only waiting for it because there's a reason why our staff participates in the sessions, but not on the panels, because I have thoughts. But I won't share them here. Instead, I will do what I was asked to do, which is to prep you for going into your lab storms. So, I don't know if any of you are parents to multiple children, or dogs or animals or any other species, and there's this common refrain that you shouldn't have favorites and they're all unique and all this other stuff, and that's the way I feel about all of the things that we have here at the summit. But I'm like 0.1% more excited about lab storms because that's the thing that I get to do as a part of like my regular job, even when we're not here at the summit. And so it feels like I'm getting to share a part of myself with the entire conference, to have all of you participating in a lab storm today. So our lab storm session, how many of you have participated in one of our virtual lab storm sessions? I don't want to show of hands. Make some noise. All right, raising hands. We already told you we can't see y'all. I don't know who I'm talking to right now. So this is why we do call and response, okay? So it sounds like, and partially see at least 2 tables back, that people have participated. But for those of you who are maybe new to Feedback Labs, the Feedback Lab community, the summit, or lab storms, our lab storms are collaborative brainstorming sessions. And so each of you will have an opportunity to hear about an organization, the work that they're doing, but also hear about a feedback challenge that they're facing. And what we do during our lab storms is that it's a concentrated focus on that one organization and their feedback challenge. So it's not a lot of, oh, well, I also got this problem. Can we talk about me too? Not at this lab storm. But that's, where you contact me and we can get you your own. But we really want to hone in and put our crowdsourced wisdom around one particular organization, knowing that we all learn in the process as well and pick up nuggets that we can take back to our respective organizations. But as is with crowdsourcing money, it's like we're all gonna put in this pot and invest in this resource, knowing that the return is a better community, right? I don't need to specifically have to take something out of this. And then when it's my turn, when I need something, I know that same group is gonna come back around the table and pass the hat, as Ronnie said, and now we get to invest in me. And that's how we do with our lab storms. So you're gonna hear from 5 amazing organizations, many of whom are resolving feedback challenges right here in Atlanta. So this, again, is another opportunity to not be extractive. If any of you have been in a session with me lately, you know that that's like one of my trigger words is extraction. But this is an opportunity for us to give back to a community that we have now been a part of and taking from and benefiting from as a part of the summit, to now contribute solutions back to organizations that are doing this work the other 364 days or 360 days that we're not here. And so please see this not only as an opportunity to engage with lab storms, to learn about them, to think about your organization within them, but also to reinvest back into the Atlanta community, and knowing that they've supported us and shared this space with us. The other thing that I want to make sure that everybody knows about the construct of the lab storms, and you'll get a reminder from your facilitators once you leave, is that we follow what's called Chatham House rules, which is that we ask that what is learned in the space leaves the space, but what is said in the space stays in the space. So we don't identify organizations. We do write a blog summary of the discussion, but it stays very high level in terms of general learnings. We're not gonna be like, and then Annie trashed 5 organizations for not knowing how to do this, right? So we're not going to identify people or their specific organizations other than the organization who is sharing during the session. So please experience that freedom to speak freely and candidly, openly and authentically. But know that we hope that you will take the lessons that are learned there. So we do not have 30-second pitches because you already signed up for your sessions. So in your name badge, you should have a little slip of paper that has your lab storm session on it. If you're not sure, you probably just have the name of a random organization, and you're like, why does it say International Rescue Committee in my name badge? Or why does it say Second Helpings Atlanta in my name badge? Because that's the lab storm that you're going to be going to. And so behind me, you can see where each of the lab storm sessions are going to be. They will start at 2 o'clock and end at 4, at which time the official proceedings of day 2, it feels like day 9 for me, having been here for a while, so I think day 2 officially, right? The official proceedings are open, are concluded, and then we will have open reception time back in the back where we have been congregating to this point. But that means that I also don't have closing remarks for anyone. Those will happen in your lab storms, and then we will see you back here in the morning for our final day. Thank you, everyone. The buses leave at 4:30.